There is a question that the people of Breathitt County, Kentucky, have not been asked in any formal record, and it is this. What do you do when you already know what is behind a door, and the knowing is the reason you cannot open it? That question lived in a farmhouse on the North Fork of the Kentucky River for 22 years. It lived there from the winter of 1871 until the spring of 1893, when a census enumerator named Gideon Marsh made a routine visit to the Harrow family property and noticed, in the interior of the main house, a door in the east wall of the central hallway that had been sealed with cut nails driven through the frame at regular intervals, top to bottom, the wood around them stained dark with years of contact with the nails iron and with something else that Marsh did not immediately identify, and then, upon closer consideration, wished he had not. He noted it in his field book. He noted the smell. He noted that the family, consisting of Enoch Harrow, aged 61, his wife Mabel, aged 58, and their adult daughter Cora, aged 34, watched him write this down and did not ask him what he was writing. They stood in the hallway and looked at the door, and then at Marsh, and then at the door again. And their expressions were not the expressions of people with something to hide. They were the expressions of people who had been waiting for a very long time for someone to come and make the decision they had been unable to make for themselves. Before we begin, drop your location in the comments and tell me what time it is there. This is not a story you want to sit with alone. Breathitt County in the 1870s was the kind of Kentucky that the rest of Kentucky did not discuss in polite company. It was called Bloody Breathitt before the Civil War, and the name stuck because the name was accurate. It was a county of long-running feuds, of violence that ran in family lines the way rivers run in valleys, always following the same channels, always finding the lowest ground. The law in Breathitt County was, at best, an interested party in disputes it had no reliable power to resolve. At worst, it was another weapon in someone else's feud. A family living on the North Fork of the Kentucky River in 1871, 3 hours by foot from the nearest town, was essentially self-governing. They made their own decisions, they handled their own problems, and when those problems were of a nature that the community could not help with and the law would not understand, they handled them in the only way the terrain and the isolation and the social structure available to them permitted. They kept the door shut. It is worth pausing here to understand what the available options actually were for a family in Breathitt County in 1871 facing what the Harrow family was facing. The nearest institution that dealt with severe mental illness was the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum in Lexington, not yet operating at the scale that would come later, barely accessible by road from Breathitt County even in good weather, and not in any practical sense available to a family without connections, without money, and without the kind of standing in the county that would get a formal commitment heard and processed in a reasonable time. The alternative was the county jail, not a treatment facility, not a care facility, a cage, where a man could be held indefinitely if he was judged a danger, but where no treatment existed and where the conditions were those of a county lockup in 1871, which is to say, adequate for short-term confinement and deeply unsuitable for anything longer. The third option was what the law and the community generally understood as the family's responsibility, to manage their own, on their own property, with their own means, indefinitely. This was not an unusual expectation. It was the expectation. The mountains of eastern Kentucky in the 1870s operated on the understanding that the family unit was the primary institution of care, the primary institution of justice in domestic matters, and the primary institution of last resort when every other option had been exhausted. The Harrow family did not fail to seek help. They operated within the only system that existed. The Harrow family had come to Breathitt County from Virginia in the 1840s. Enoch Harrow's father, a man named Crawford Harrow, had built the farmhouse on the North Fork property in 1848, and the family had worked that land continuously since. It was not a prosperous property, but it was a stable one. 40 acres of mixed bottomland and hillside, a good spring, a sound house by the standards of the region. Enoch Harrow, who inherited it from his father in 1866, was known to his neighbors as a hard-working and quiet man. Not sociable, but not unfriendly. He attended church with his wife on the irregular schedule that mountain roads imposed. He had 3 children who survived infancy. A son named Craw, named for his grandfather, born in 1852, a second son, Thomas, born in 1857, and the daughter, Cora, born in 1859. By 1871, Craw Harrow would have been 19 years old and Thomas 14. By 1871, only Cora remained in the house with her parents. Craw and Thomas Harrow appear in no record after 1869. The east door of the Harrow farmhouse was first noted as sealed in a letter written by a Methodist circuit rider named Jonathan Breed, who visited the property in February 1873 to conduct a prayer service and record a birth. Breed's letters, preserved in the records of the Methodist Episcopal Church South at Vanderbilt University's Divinity School archive, describe a house that was well maintained in all outward respects, but contained in the central hallway a door that had been fastened shut in a manner suggesting it is intended not to be opened. He noted a smell in that part of the house that he described as faint but persistent, the quality of which I could not place, but which unsettled me considerably. He asked Enoch Harrow about the door. Harrow said the room behind it had been closed since a structural problem with the floor made it unsafe to enter. Breed accepted this explanation, noted it with what reads, in retrospect, like deliberate incuriosity, and did not return to the subject. He visited the Harrow property 6 more times over the following decade. He noted the door in his letters on 3 of those occasions. He never asked about it again. In his final letter mentioning it, written in 1881, he wrote, "The door on the east wall continues as before. I have decided that whatever is behind it is between the Harrow family and their God, and I have neither the standing nor the desire to interpose myself in that conversation." That entry sat in a church archive for over 100 years. Gideon Marsh arrived at the Harrow property in April 1893 as part of a preliminary survey connected to the 1893 Breathitt County property assessment. He had no foreknowledge of the Harrow family's history. He had no particular reason to expect anything unusual. He was doing the ordinary work of property documentation, recording structures, noting conditions, collecting information that would feed into the county's assessment process. He was competent at this work and had no stake in finding anything other than what was there to be found. He was not looking for anything in particular. He was doing the ordinary work of walking properties and recording what was on them, the same work that had been done by dozens of enumerators in dozens of counties across the state that spring. He was 31 years old and had been doing this work for 4 years. He had visited hundreds of farmhouses. He knew what a sealed door looked like when a room was genuinely unsafe, and he knew what it looked like when a door was sealed for another reason. The nails in the Harrow door were not structural repairs. They were placed with an intent that was neither architectural nor casual. They were spaced too evenly. There were too many of them. The wood around the lower nails had been reinforced with an additional strip of oak nailed across the frame at floor level that appeared to be a later addition to the original ceiling. Something had, at some point, made it necessary to reinforce the bottom of the door. Marsh wrote in his field book, in the entry later admitted to the Breathitt County Court record, "East Hall door, sealed with cut nails, minimum 40 in number, frame reinforced at base. Smell present, persistent, low, sweet foul. Family present during observation. No explanation offered voluntarily." Enoch Harrow stated on inquiry that the room had been closed due to structural concerns. This explanation is not consistent with the physical evidence of the sealing method. He finished his survey of the property, thanked the family, and rode directly to Jackson, the county seat, where he presented his field book to the county sheriff. Sheriff Abel Cornett rode out to the Harrow property the following morning with 2 deputies. He brought a pry bar. The Harrow family stood in the hallway as before and watched, and as before, they did not object and did not explain. Mabel Harrow, according to the deputy's statement filed with the court, was weeping silently before the first nail came out. She did not ask them to stop. The smell that came through the crack when the door shifted in its frame was the smell of decades rather than months. It was the accumulated, dried, settled smell of something that had long since passed through every active stage of decomposition and become something more ancient and more still. The room behind the door was a standard farmhouse bedroom, a single window, a plank floor, a stone fireplace on the east wall. The window had been boarded over from the inside. The fireplace had been mortared shut. The room was, in every physical sense, sealed from the outside world as thoroughly as the door itself. Deputy Rankin's statement describes what was found in the room in the careful, abbreviated language of a man writing for an official record while processing something he was not fully equipped to process. He wrote, "The room contained evidence of prior occupation. There were personal effects, clothing, a blanket, a wooden box containing tools and personal articles, consistent with long-term residence. The condition of the room indicated it had not been entered in a very considerable period of time. Human remains were present. The human remains in the room belonged to two individuals, a man and a younger male." Based on the physical evidence, Dr. Preston Lacey of Jackson, who examined the remains in May 1893, estimated the older individual had been in the room for somewhere between 15 and 25 years. The younger individual, somewhat less. Neither body showed evidence of the kind of trauma that would indicate violence as the cause of death. What the room showed, in the accumulated physical evidence of its contents, was something that Dr. Lacey described in his official report as a period of voluntary or involuntary confinement of significant duration prior to death. Enoch Harrow gave a statement to Sheriff Cornett on the afternoon of May 3, 1893. It was the only statement he gave, and he gave it in full without prompting, in the steady voice of a man who had been rehearsing it, or simply carrying it, for a very long time. Mabel Harrow was not present for it. Cora Harrow was not present. There were two deputies in the room and the sheriff's clerk, and Enoch spoke to a point on the wall above Cornett's head and did not look at any of the men listening to him. When he finished, he sat very still for a moment, and then he said, "I expect you'll need to write that down." Cornett said it had already been written. Enoch nodded, and that was the end of it. Craw Harrow, his eldest son, had begun showing signs of what Enoch described as the sickness that comes in the blood sometimes in the late 1860s when he was 17 years old. The sickness, as Enoch described it, and as Dr. Lacey's retrospective assessment confirmed to the extent such a thing was possible, was likely what would now be recognized as severe psychiatric illness, the kind with episodes of violence that a 19th century mountain family had no language for and no institution to address. There was no asylum within realistic reach of Breathitt County in 1871 that would have taken Craw Harrow. There was no physician with the training or the medication that might have helped him. There was no legal framework that would have protected the family or the community from his episodes in any practical way. There was only a family with a problem that the world around them had provided no means to address. In the winter of 1871, during an episode that Enoch described to Sheriff Cornett without elaboration, it became necessary to contain Craw. Thomas, the younger son, chose to stay with his brother. Enoch said this part very quietly. Thomas chose to stay. The door was sealed. Food and water were passed through a gap at the floor level, hence the reinforced lower frame, for a period of time that Enoch gave to Sheriff Cornett as some years. And then the passing of food and water stopped because there was no longer a need for it to continue. And the door remained shut because opening it would have required decisions that Enoch Harrow was not able to make alone, and Mabel Harrow was not able to make alone. And Cora, who had been 12 years old in 1871 and was 34 in 1893, had grown up in a house with a sealed door and had learned to live around what was behind it the way you learn to live around any grief that has no resolution, by not looking at it directly, by treating it as a fixed feature of the world rather than a choice that could be revisited. No charges were filed. The Breathitt County Circuit Court reviewed the evidence in the statement and reached the conclusion that no crime, as it was then legally defined, had been committed. The Circuit Court judge wrote in his closing notation, "The Harrow family acted within the constraints of their circumstance and their time. What they did was not the worst option available to them. It may, under the conditions they faced, have been the only one. Enoch Harrow died the following winter. Mabel Harrow died in 1897. Cora Harrow left Breathitt County after her mother's death. She appears in the 1900 census in Knoxville, Tennessee, listed as a seamstress. She is not recorded as having married or had children. She died in 1941, 62 years after the door in her family's farmhouse was first nailed shut. No obituary mentions her family or her origins. Think about what that means. Cora Harrow was 12 years old in 1871 when the door was sealed. She was 34 when it was opened. She had grown up in a house with a sealed door in the hallway, with brothers behind it, and she had learned to live her life around that fact the way water learns to flow around a stone. Not by resolving it, not by ignoring it, but by incorporating it so completely into the ordinary texture of daily existence that it became, eventually, simply the shape of things. She had been 12 years old when it started, and she had been living inside that shape for 22 years, when Gideon Marsh walked in with his field book and his pencil and his outside world sense of what normal looked like. What Cora Harrow carried out of Breathitt County when she left, and what she carried through 44 more years in Knoxville as a seamstress who did not marry and did not speak of her origins, this is not knowable from the record. The record ends with a census entry and a death date. What it cannot record is the specific weight of having been 12 years old and present when a door was nailed shut, and of having understood or half understood or tried not to understand what was on the other side of it for the entirety of your youth and your young adulthood. That weight does not appear in any document. It only appears in the space left by all the things Cora Harrow is not recorded as having said. Today, the property on the North Fork of the Kentucky River no longer has a standing structure on it. The farmhouse was demolished or collapsed at some point in the early 20th century. The record of exactly when and how is inconsistent. The land passed through 3 owners before being absorbed into a larger holding in the 1950s. A man who worked a neighboring farm in the 1930s told his grandson, who shared the story with the Breathitt County Historical Society in 2006, that the old Harrow place was the one property in that part of the county that no one had ever tried to farm again after the family left. He said local people called it the quiet place, though he could not say precisely why the name had stuck. Here is the question that the Harrow family leaves behind, and there is no clean answer to it. They made a decision that no one should have to make. They made it without guidance, without resources, without any institutional support of any kind, in a county and a time that provided none. They sealed a door, and they kept it sealed for 22 years, and they went to church, and they grew their garden, and they passed food through a gap at the floor level until there was no longer any need to. And then they went on living in that house with that door in that hallway. And here is the part that I want you to think about. A circuit court judge in 1893 looked at everything they had done and said it may have been the only option available to them. Not the worst thing they could have done. The only thing. Was that true? Could you have done differently? And if the answer is no, if you can hold yourself inside the specific walls of what they had, and what they knew and what existed around them in 1871 in Breathitt County, Kentucky, then what do you call what they did? Is it a crime? Is it love made monstrous by circumstance? Is it something for which we do not have a word because we have never had to invent one? The circuit judge who reviewed the case wrote that the Harrows had acted within the constraints of their circumstance. But there is another way to read what happened in that house for 22 years that does not resolve as cleanly as the judge's notation suggests. 2 people lived behind a nailed door and eventually died behind it. They did not choose to be there in any sense that the word choose can bear the weight of. Whatever Craw needed and whatever Thomas chose, the door was nailed from the outside. The family maintained it from the outside, and the family went on with their lives, growing their garden, attending church twice a year, selling eggs in town, with that door in that hallway, and they carried it for 22 years without telling anyone. That is not a simple story. It has never been a simple story. The judge said it was the only option. Maybe it was. But only option and right thing are not the same words, and the people who get to decide which is which are usually not the ones living behind the door. Drop it in the comments. I want to know where you land. If these histories that were sealed and nearly lost are the reason you found this channel, subscribe and ring the bell. There is more. It does not get easier. The Hollows keep their secrets. They have had a long time to learn how. The property on the North Fork is a field now. The door is long gone. But there was a door, and it was in a hallway, and it was nailed shut, and behind it 2 people lived and eventually died, and the family that put them there went on living in that house for 22 years. That is the fact. That is the whole, complete, unembellished fact. Everything else is the question of what you do with it.